Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome to the Second Reading Podcast for the week of June 20th. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas, and I'm joined by my colleague Josh Blank. And at the moment, I'm trying really hard, Josh, I'm realizing that whenever we do this introduction, I want to start by impersonating one of the people in the intro.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think it's a good idea, and I haven't done it, but I just felt like I needed to share that.
You do a mean Pete Laney.
Well, it's kind of de rigueur. You have to do a Pete Laney if you follow Texas politics for a while.
Go look up Pete Laney.
So today we'll talk about two contrasting sets of political events that took place in Texas recently: the state convention of the Texas Democratic Party in San Antonio, and the visit of the presumptive Republican nominee, Mr. Donald Trump, to Texas last week. So let's start with the state convention of the frankly beleaguered Texas Democratic Party. First sentence, and we're already picking on them. Oh. It's almost too easy to start by mentioning that if you blinked, you missed it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, we follow politics relatively closely, and I knew this was coming up, and I, attuned to these things, and even so, it was so fast. It was there, and it was gone.
Yeah, so let's talk. I guess we should backtrack a little bit and talk about, and we've done this a little bit when we talked about the Republican convention, but talk a little bit about what these conventions are about, what they're supposed to be doing.
Right. In basic and short, they decide on the platform for the state party. They might determine, what rules the party's going to operate by and whether they want to change any. There's a lot of meetings.
Yeah, I mean, it's the one time when people, especially in a place like Texas, it's not like the meeting of the Rhode Island Democratic Party where everybody can just get together and then drive 20 minutes home.
Right. I mean, presumably with telephones and the internet, they could just talk and meet and those kinds of things. But that's where the other piece of this comes into play, which is that informally, there's just a lot of networking that goes on in these things. This is where Democrats in San Antonio get to meet the people in Houston and Dallas and, to a lesser extent, Midland.
And what we call politicking. I mean, they're talking about the direction of the party. People are talking about the candidates they like, and there is a lot of internal kind of team play that goes on between different factions, groups, cliques, if you will, right, in the party.
But for people not in the party, it's primarily seen as a media event, right?
Right, and that's anymore. That's for better or for worse. I think that's our expectation. So we started off by being kind of mean about, it came and it went, and part of that was that it really didn't last very long.
No, it was only like a day and a half.
Yeah, it was a couple days being generous, I think.
It was a long evening.
Well, as it turned out, one of them was a particularly long evening, and we'll get to that. There were two things really front and center to the extent that this was potentially a positive, shall we say, media event for the Democrats, right? So the first thing was all this talk about Donald Trump and whether Donald Trump is going to hurt Republicans, even in Republican states like Texas, did seem to prevent something of an opportunity for Texas Democrats to grab at least local media coverage in various markets in Texas and say, we're here to take on Donald Trump. There's blood in the water. Here's why Republicans or independents or the world should take a second look at us, even though we haven't won an election in decades here in Texas, statewide election.
If nothing else, a strong, unified, well-delivered message as to why Texas Democrats are a viable alternative to the politics that Trump is espousing, even if it's not super well received in Texas because of Texas's sort of generally Republican and conservative leanings, would still be a win for the Texas Democrats. They don't get a lot of opportunities. Remember, they don't have the governorship. They don't have the lieutenant governorship. They can't go out and send a statewide Democrat out and get a bunch of media coverage. This is a chance for them to actually, take this on and maybe, get a small win.
Yeah, and they actually had a little bit of a hook for this. We talked last week or the week before about Hillary Clinton having done an interview in New York Magazine and letting loose with this trial balloon. And in fairness, as we said, I think at the time, it wasn't too much more than that. But nonetheless, the national Democratic, the presidential candidate did make news by saying that, she was going to fight for Texas. And you'd have thought they would have been a little more keyed up on that.
Yeah, I'll just add to that real quick. I mean, historically, the media does want to hook on to a competitive Texas.
Yeah,
they're looking for it.
And I love all our friends in the media, but you got to give them a hook.
Yeah, you got to help them out.
Do some work.
So that was one of the two things going on from the media event per se. What was the second?
And so the other thing then was Julian Castro, former mayor of San Antonio, now the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development for the Obama administration, one of twin brothers. His twin brother is a congressman from San Antonio. Julian Castro was the keynote speaker at the convention, and one of the reasons he got that job, other than the buzz around him as a national political figure, as somebody who's graduated from city-level politics and state politics to the national level, but there's been a lot of speculation for really years now,
right,
that he would be a viable presidential or vice presidential candidate for Hillary Clinton.
Right, as a young rising star Hispanic from a state that the Democrats would like to make competitive. It just the math adds up really.
Yeah,
easily.
and he has there's a lot of things that are positive. He's got a great story. He's got this twin brother, and they're very good at telling stories of twin brother hijinks.
Mm-hmm.
Their mom was a kind of early generation Mexican-American activist in San Antonio. They have a little bit of a rags to riches story, went to Harvard, et cetera, et cetera.
Harvard and didn't they go to different, one go to Harvard and one go to Yale or something, or one go to Harvard and one go to Stanford? It's something amazing.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think one went to Harvard and one went to Stanford, and I honestly can't remember which one went to which.
They're twins.
Google it. They're twins, and they probably switched places while they were doing it anyway.
Definitely.
So all that said, how did this turn out for the Democrats? Well,
wah, wah. That was just me.
This
that
is where I feel
like
we need one of those little horns or something.
Yeah. In post.
So let's talk about these things. And really, what happened? We really should start with the second thing that we were expecting. So, overall, what we would say is that the Democratic Party demonstrated really poor media ability and really poor organizational ability in the way that they pulled this off. And it kind of went south almost from the beginning.
Or before it even started.
Really. About the day of Castro's big speech, he's doing an interview with a state reporter. I think the first place this came out was an interview with Peggy Fecack from the San Antonio Express News. And he's being asked about the vice presidential potential, and he begins the response by being just kind of demure in the way that we expect people to say, "Oh, shucks."
Yeah, that's
nice. But then Peggy, who we've worked with, is a very good reporter, kind of says, "Well, do you know that you're being vetted?" And he basically has to say no. And she follows up, "Would you know if you were being vetted?" And he said, "Well, yeah." So basically, he announced that he wasn't being vetted for the vice presidential spot. So one of the big points of buildup for him being the keynote speaker was deflated before he even got to the stage.
Right. And worse yet, most of the news coming out of the convention, if you will, was that Castro was not a likely VP pick anymore. Instead of anything about the Democrats, the state Democratic Party, it was about this big deflation of Democratic hopes, which they didn't need.
And so on top of that, the organization of the convention itself was apparently pretty poorly executed. Even the night that Castro was going to speak, everybody ran late. He was going to be way late in the evening.
It was overbooked to begin with.
Yeah. People were leaving. They ran long. They changed it. And so in the end, he spoke to about a half-full convention hall by most accounts. And he spoke as somebody whose upward mobility had been thwarted, in newspapers across the country.
Right.
Prior to his appearing.
It was so badly organized that basically they had to move him up 10 speaking spots because they were, first of all, running so late, but the delegates were leaving. And they were just leaving en masse, and they were like, "We need to get this guy out here now." And of course, it didn't stop them from leaving because what was the reason at this point?
And another reporter that we work with a lot and we like, Jonathan Tylove of the Austin American Statesman, did a nice blow-by-blow in his usual multimedia manner with tweets and videos and stuff of this. So if you're interested in this, go have a look at Jonathan's piece. I think it was Saturday or Sunday. It doesn't really matter when it was because it's on the internet. So the story coming out of the convention was not the Democrats are here to, to take advantage of Donald Trump, and there might be a leading Texas Democrat on the ballot. There will definitely not be a Texas Democrat on the ballot, at least not this one. And the Texas Democratic Party is, as is often the case, it seems to be lately, kind of in disarray.
Yeah, and I mean, on the one hand, it's a little unfair. I think there's a tendency to want to read into these conventions, and the platforms and the goings on as being somehow really meaningful. And there's a lot of reasons that it's not super meaningful,
Right.
in any real sense. But there is sort of an aspect of, you look at this and you think, the Democratic Party is described often as beleaguered, and many other.
We, in fact, just did that.
Which we just did, yeah. But, the thing is, you do say, like, here you've got this few days where you've got media coverage, you have control over the message, you have the ability to try to actually shape what the coverage of your party and your convention is in the state. It's one of the rare chances to actually get in front of this audience, and it's just such a wild swing and a miss. It does make you say, well, how are they supposed to organize credible statewide campaigns if they can't organize a one-day meeting?
Yeah, I went to look for a video of Castro's speech just to give him some love and play an audio excerpt. And in Googling it, I couldn't find the speech, but I did find, in part, because I'm convinced it must be there somewhere, at least somebody's cell phone on YouTube. But every time you go to search it, it's just all buried in the fact that, Castro let on that he wasn't being vetted to be the VP. So, right. Okay, this just gets sad. But it does, for those of you that are studying politics, shall we say, this does give you a sense of what we mean when we're talking about the party as organization. Parties have capacities to do things and to do them well or to not do them well, and it's hard not to look at this and see it as an indication of just how weak the Democratic Party organization is. Now, given that, the other thing we want to talk about today pointed to some interesting aspects of the other major party, the Republican Party in Texas, and that came with Donald Trump's visit to Texas roughly on the same days as the Democratic Convention. They kind of took place at the same time. So a lot of people, I think early on, asked the question, why would Trump visit Texas to begin with? It's a Republican state. As we're seeing, the opposition is pretty weak. We haven't seen a competitive presidential candidate in a long time. And yet here's Donald Trump spending a couple of days here doing 4 or 5 events, including big public events in a couple of big cities. Why do this?
Well, I mean, so the first and kind of most crass but true and obvious one is that Texas is like the campaign ATM for national politicians.
For both parties.
For both parties, exactly. I mean, we mentioned Hillary Clinton discussing Texas as a battleground state in an interview in New York Magazine a few weeks ago. And, why would she do that? Well, she's certainly not going to spend a bunch of her resources in Houston because it's super expensive, or San Antonio or Dallas. This is a state that's super big, super expensive, but there are a lot of Democratic donors in Texas too, and they have a lot of money to spend. And, if nothing else, you do want to wave your hand and sort of be respectful to the state before you go and ask these guys for money.
Yeah, and there is a lot of Republican money here.
Huge amount of Republican money here. And the fact is Donald Trump is going to, one of the big stories from last week was how Donald Trump had raised so little money in comparison to Hillary Clinton and how he had to get his campaign finance organization going. This is maybe a first step in that direction and fixing that a little bit. So one reason is just Texas is just, the national ATM for large political campaigns.
And I guess we should pause and just note that even though people are saying, and even Donald Trump sometimes is saying, I'm independently wealthy, I can fund my own campaign. These things are enormously expensive. And frankly, Trump is, in a less public way, not shown a whole lot of willingness to spend every last dime he has to run for president.
Well, right. I mean, you should expect that a campaign is going to cost about $1 billion. He's not going to spend $1 billion.
Right. So he does need to raise money, despite the fact that his argument is, I'm independent. I'm not beholden to donors.
Right.
So another thing I think that was driving this is a little more subtle, and that is, and I'm not utterly convinced by this, but a secondary reason that definitely contributed to this. So we have to remember that Donald Trump's last real contender for the nomination, and somebody who has still held out his endorsement, is Senator Ted Cruz of Texas. So it does make sense for Trump, now that he is the presumptive nominee, and all we mean when we say that is that he's not been formally nominated by the convention, but despite continuing chatter about challenging him at the convention, he is the person that everybody presumes will be the candidate. And so it does make sense to come to Texas and speak to Texas Republicans and in a sense almost kind of present himself. I think now if he wasn't coming to raise money, he probably wouldn't be quite as worried about that. But if you're going to be here to raise money, you might as well do some public events. And I think the third reason he comes is that, he does this the same reason he goes anywhere, and the same reasons that he does these big public rallies that have become his trademark. It's still earning him what we call free media. That is, the cable television stations still often cover these speeches live. I mean, they've been criticized for this. It's happening a little bit less now. It's a little less newsworthy now that it's been pushed out by some other things, and I think that that the primary is a little more settled. Nonetheless, I was flipping around the news channels looking for something over the weekend, and there was Donald Trump live on, one of the kind of off-brand networks, the One America News Network. If you like it, it's fine, but it's not CNN or MSNBC or the Fox News Channel. It's a little bit more
it's a little racier.
It's a little racier. We've talked
foxier.
about that. It's kind of Fox squared in a way. Fox with a lower neckline.
Let's get off that tangent.
So, when he goes and gives these big speeches, in a way, it almost doesn't matter where he is.
Yeah, and in some ways, there's an advantage to actually being in Texas. I mean, the part of this is just asking the question, why is he in Texas? And then he gets the clips. And we were talking about there's sort of a diminishing marginal return to these things for most politicians, maybe not Donald Trump. But, as the campaign wears on and he starts to focus more on the battleground states, presumably.
And by battleground states, we mean those states in the general election we know from the last, several presidential elections are more competitive. Unlike Texas, which we don't expect to be very competitive, these are races that are decided typically by a few points.
Right, and really are what the outcome of the election usually end up hinging on. So when Trump gets to the point where maybe he's, spending, most of his time in places like Colorado and Ohio and Pennsylvania and Missouri and Florida, right? After a while, once you've done your 6th or 7th or 8th event in a 2-week span in Missouri, it's not news anymore.
Right.
And so for Trump, the ability to, now of course with Trump, anything could be made news. But, part of this is by him kind of continuing to move around, in some sense, the fact of, again, even asking the question, why is he in Texas, puts it on television. And then we watch it. And then we talk about it. And we're talking about it now.
And there's a funny, I think there's a funny little logical thing about that. If you look at these 2 points about Trump, the fact that, Texas is an ATM and he gets the free media, those two things are a little bit linked in the sense that he's become fairly dependent, perhaps, on this free media model until he raises more money and can actually launch a more orthodox campaign and pay for more media that he needs.
Right.
So, So then this leads to what is interesting about this whole affair from the perspective of Texas politics? Because frankly, I went and sat through watched and enjoyed most of those 2 Trump speeches that I found on the internet and saw a little bit of that one live. And they were pretty standard Trump fare by now. He didn't do anything crazy out of the ordinary, but, just the usual mixture of, counter heckling the hecklers and, talk about heroes. It was a lot of the same campaign messaging. You said
at one point it seemed like he might have thought he was in Indiana.
Yeah, he talked a lot about the Lou Holtz and some of his other Indiana sports endorsements, Bobby Knight. So, yeah, it was the usual kind of odd experience of watching Donald Trump. It's odd and still can be mesmerizing is the wrong word, but it can be it can be hard to turn away in some ways. But the Texas, the elements that were really sort of interesting had less to do with what Trump said and more to do with some of the things that were said by one of the people that introduced him, that was one of his that was doing the introducing, the Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick. And what Patrick had to say shows us some interesting things about the intersection in this moment between national and state politics. So let's hear some audio from Dan Patrick.
We have worked so hard, everyone in this room, to elect Republicans in Texas in almost every office. Today, out of our 254 counties, 141 do not have one Democrat elected because of you. We do not want them to get a foothold. Donald Trump's going to win Texas, but not by 2 points, not by 5 points, not by 10 points. We want to send the Democrats packing forever. Donald Trump will be the change agent that you've been praying for and hoping for and wishing for and working for your entire life. This is the election. If you have anyone who's a friend, a family member, a coworker that says, I don't know, here's what you tell them. You're voting straight Republican ticket in Texas and sending Donald Trump to the White House.
That is Dan Patrick at his rabble-rousing best, I think. And there are lots of other things in there where he said lots of really rude things about Hillary Clinton, and he only spoke for 3 or 4 minutes. He actually got a lot in there. So even in that clip, there's a lot that's interesting. What strikes you?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting watching him sort of navigate this task of attaching sort of this controversial national candidate, Donald Trump, to the state party ticket, which, for all accounts has been pretty successful.
Yeah,
right?
As Patrick himself says, we're cranking here.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. It's hard. I mean, I think it's really interesting, and I'm still kind of working out how to say some of this. But I mean, on the one hand, you're sort of saying, we need to make sure that we don't give the Democrats a foothold. But we've been so successful, and this guy's so great. It's like, well, then why are we worried about giving the Democrats a foothold? You know?
Why are we even talking about this?
Exactly, and it's sort of like, make sure you vote straight. When I ask you, what are you doing in November? It's not, the first thing wasn't voting for Donald Trump. It was vote a straight Republican ticket, and you can almost put in parentheses, and that includes Donald Trump. You know, so it was. I mean, Dan Patrick's very good. As a very good politician, but I mean, there's sort of slipping back and forth between kind of what he's saying, what he's not saying, and kind of the comparison of these things was very interesting.
Yeah, it's almost. I mean, he's doing what a good surrogate does at the state level, and that he's doing the work, he's working on the problems from both ends without actually, while kind of concealing what the real problem is. So on one hand, he's reminding Trump supporters who may be there simply because they're attracted to Trump, and they may be Republicans, but they may be disaffected Republicans that are attracted to Trump, reminding them Trump's a Republican, vote straight ticket, so that and that's speaking to this subterranean or barely subterranean concern that Trump at the top of the ticket could hurt state legislative candidates, judicial, other candidates on other parts of the ballot that are Republicans.
But he's also saying, to other people, so the people kind of not in the room in some ways, hey, make sure you still show up. Right. Make sure you still show up and you vote straight Republican ticket, right?
We are, we're Republicans, we're successful, and this can't get in the way of that.
Right.
Donald Trump is a change agent out there. We don't want him to be a change agent here in Texas.
Right. I think, and then sort of another sort of kind of interesting kind of thing about that is, Patrick is the real bona fide conservative, really second only to maybe Ted Cruz. I would say probably Greg Abbott, but only because more people know who Greg Abbott is.
Yeah. I mean, I tend to think, I think we probably think a little bit differently about that. I mean, I think you're right that if we look at the numbers, the proportions are probably pretty close. It's just that Greg Abbott, being governor, he benefits from the symbolic stature of the office. And so he's naturally just more well-known than the lieutenant governor is. But you're right. I mean, but I do think the way I think about that is if you're the Donald Trump campaign and you could say, okay, I want to prove I want to have stroke with conservative voters in Texas.
Right.
Who do I want more than, who are the top 3 people I want in order? Well,
Ted Cruz.
You want Ted Cruz.
But that's not happening.
That's not happening. You probably want Greg Abbott, and then you'll settle for Dan Patrick, but it's a pretty good settle.
Definitely.
Right? I mean, Dan Patrick is very popular and was the candidate of, both evangelicals and Tea Party Republicans when he ran for lieutenant governor.
And speaking to your point earlier about Trump coming to Texas and kind of shoring up his support in the land of Ted Cruz, if you can't get Ted Cruz, why not get the guy who just won statewide with much of the same coalition, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's right.
And make that case for you.
So I think it's to finally kind of talk about this in Texas terms. We and lots of other insider people have talked about the question of what is, it's almost sinister. What does Dan Patrick want?
Yeah.
Lots of talk about Dan Patrick wanting to run for another office, either to run for governor to challenge Abbott, or maybe even challenging Cornyn for U.S. Senate.
And he's unequivocally denied that he's going to, challenge Abbott on multiple occasions. Now, again, things change. I hear Marco Rubio is running for the Senate again.
He changed his mind.
It's okay. People change their mind.
We're all human beings here.
But this is sort of a question. I mean, it's interesting watching Dan Patrick proceed through this electoral cycle where, he was quick to endorse Cruz. It was hard not to see a Cruz event without and you just kind of look around and say, where's Dan? Oh, there's Dan Patrick.
Right.
He'd be sort of, there he is in the background. And
there was definitely, and often in the foreground.
Often.
He was often standing right. I mean, he had a spot.
For
he
a
liked
tall
to stand
guy.
right on Ted Cruz's right shoulder.
Mm-hmm.
I think he moved back a little bit after he wore that ugly plaid shirt. It seems like he got relegated, but then they brought him back in.
But then, once Cruz was out of the race, he was pretty quick to endorse Trump. I think he was the first of the statewide to go in and endorse Trump. In addition to that, he's been sort of one of the most outspoken critics of sort of transgender bathroom rights in the country. I mean, he's really been out there a lot, and it does sort of re-energize this question of to what end?
What's he doing?
Is this for another political office, or is this something else?
Well, and I think I think when you see him with Trump, there's a couple of different things going on that you have to notice, and we were talking about this earlier. I mean, one of them is that there's a real affinity here between, stylistically as much as substantively, between Trump and Dan Patrick. They both come out, they're both invoking this kind of conservative form of populism that resonates pretty well in Texas. Obviously, for Trump, it's resonating in lots of other parts of the country. Mm-hmm. But that strain of, it's an interesting circa 2015-16 version of populism that we see throughout the history of Texas. Sometimes it's on the left, sometimes it's on the right. This is definitely a bit more on the right, and it resonates, and they really resonate when it comes to things like immigration and cultural identity. Though, as you kind of imply, there's other ways in which Trump and Patrick are very different, and that is why Patrick helps Trump. I mean, Trump is definitely a much more secular candidate, shall we say, than Dan Patrick, who we hear in the intro of the podcast, talking about Christianity and his
his
commitments.
famous line is that he's a Christian first, a conservative second, and a Republican third, and he's made that his hallmark. And
that's really pretty good for Dan Patrick.
But they're also similar stylistically, right? I mean, in a sense, at least historically, right? They're both. I mean, Dan Patrick's sort of was a talk radio host before he moved on to the Texas Senate. He understands how to transition as a media personality into a political personality in a way that Trump has obviously done, one could say very successfully up until this point.
Yeah, in some ways that's what makes it this very contemporary form of populism that's rooted in non-political celebrity, if you will. Mm-hmm. And I think we can't really leave without saying that there is something else that could be a little more limited, but still interesting in terms of Dan Patrick's profile, and that is Dan Patrick becomes lieutenant governor at a time when that office, which had traditionally been known, historically anyway, as a very influential and powerful office in Texas politics, had been somewhat in eclipse. So we don't want to go too much into this, and there's some of this, and there's lots has been written about this, but a lot has been written about this. But during the last decade and a half, as Rick Perry became a very unprecedented long-term governor, he's in the office for 14 years, which nobody ever really imagined anybody would be governor that long. Right. The office was occupied by Lieutenant Governor David Dewhurst, who was not particularly he was sometimes politically aggressive, but he wasn't politically skilled in the way that the historical figures we think of as influential lieutenant governors. More recently, Bob Bullock, if you live in Austin, that big museum that's named after him is a testament to how effective Bob Bullock was as lieutenant governor. Before him, Bill Hobby. And so there is a piece of this that I think we saw going in, that when both Abbott and Dan Patrick assumed the governorship and the lieutenant governorship respectively, it's been an interesting question to see how much of a reset there was going to be. And I think we have seen Dan Patrick unambiguously, whether he wants to do something else or not, is very interested in infusing more power and influence into the lieutenant governor's chair.
Yeah, that definitely seems right. I mean, I think one of the things that's almost been surprising, if you're focusing on this particular question about the power dynamic between the governor and the lieutenant governor, again, and sort of this historical reset, has been the degree to which I think Patrick, to a large degree, is, outmaneuvered Abbott. I mean, I think Abbott is, still very strong.
He's doing fine.
He's doing fine. But, I mean, it really is the case that Patrick's personality as being sort of a powerful figure with a microphone and sort of his sort of natural political gifts, he has really sort of made himself, and is working on making himself, the primary player in Texas politics in a way that, I think is not surprising, but it's amazing how quickly I think it's happened.
Yeah, and I think that Abbott is still, I wouldn't overplay that too much to the extent that I think Greg Abbott has done a good job of defending the position of governor. But, I mean, when you see Dan Patrick, I think your point is hard to deny when you see Dan Patrick on the stage introducing Donald Trump like that. He seems very much in the moment right now in a way that, even if Trump loses, it's hard for me to imagine that that's going to hurt him.
I wouldn't even cross my mind that it would, honestly.
Right.
His brand is that strong.
So that's what we make of Donald Trump coming to Texas. We wind up talking about Dan Patrick and the lieutenant governor without too much of a reach. So thanks all of you for listening. Have a good week, and we'll see you next week. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project and the Project 2021 Development Studio at the University of Texas at Austin.